I was born in a quiet, almost forgotten town, a place that seemed to exist in its own bubble, far removed from the rush of the larger cities. The streets were narrow and uneven, lined with small brick and wooden houses, some weathered by wind and rain, others freshly painted in muted pastel colors. In the mornings, the scent of freshly baked bread drifted from the local bakery, mingling with the earthy aroma of dew-soaked soil and the faint, sweet smell of wildflowers growing along the sidewalks. Every corner of the town held a memory: the stone fountain where children played tag, the old oak tree that served as a fortress for imaginary armies, the riverbank where we dared each other to jump into the icy water. These streets were my world, and every day I explored them with the curiosity and wonder that only a child can possess. My family was modest but close-knit, each member playing a distinct role in the rhythm of daily life. My father worked in a local factory, a massive building with towering smokestacks that belched smoke into the sky. The roar of machinery, the hiss of steam, and the metallic scent of oil and iron were constants in our lives. I would watch him leave every morning, his hands calloused and scarred, shoulders hunched under the weight of labor, yet his eyes always carried a glimmer of pride. My mother, gentle and determined, kept the house in order. She had a way of making our small home feel expansive, filling it with warmth, music, and the aroma of cooking. Her patience and quiet strength were lessons I absorbed without realizing it, learning that care, love, and resilience were as powerful as courage on the battlefield. My older brother was already a figure of authority and responsibility in my eyes. He watched over me and my younger sister with a protective gaze, teaching us through example what it meant to be disciplined and strong. From an early age, the concept of duty to one's country was instilled in me, not as a lecture, but as a natural extension of daily life. I remember sitting in the classroom, listening to teachers recount stories of wars long past, of heroes who defended the land, of battles that shaped the destiny of nations. These stories fascinated me. They painted a world where courage, honor, and sacrifice were the measure of a person, where the young could rise to greatness through their actions. I didn't yet understand the horrors behind the glory, but I felt the pull of duty like a magnetic force, drawing me toward a life of purpose. I spent countless hours wandering the fields and forests surrounding our town, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends. We built forts from sticks and stones, imagined ourselves as generals commanding armies, and practiced strategies for imaginary battles. Our games were elaborate and detailed. We kept meticulous logs, assigned ranks, and held mock councils to resolve disputes over territory or strategy. We believed ourselves invincible, dreaming of heroism without understanding the cost that real courage demanded. These hours of play, full of laughter and occasional scrapes and bruises, were lessons in leadership, teamwork, and imagination, skills that would later serve me in ways I could not yet foresee. School was another formative arena. There, I learned discipline, perseverance, and the importance of observation. I watched classmates falter and succeed, learning which behaviors led to respect and which to consequences. Teachers were often strict but fair, shaping our understanding of fairness, justice, and accountability. I remember long hours spent memorizing history, geography, and literature, but more importantly, I remember the subtle lessons embedded within those subjects: the value of knowledge, the need for patience, and the understanding that actions have consequences far beyond our immediate perception. Even at this young age, I began to feel the first stirrings of ambition. I wanted to contribute, to prove my worth, to make a mark that would extend beyond the small confines of my town. I imagined myself as a protector, a hero, someone who could rise to challenges and shape outcomes with courage and intelligence. These ambitions were not mere fantasies. They were aspirations intertwined with a sense of responsibility, a desire to honor my family and my country. My childhood summers were filled with the kind of experiences that leave indelible marks on a person. I remember the long days spent exploring hidden paths in the woods, the thrill of catching fish in the shallow river, the smell of campfires where we roasted what little food we had, and the hush of nightfall when the forest seemed alive with secrets. We would lie on the grass, staring at the stars, inventing stories of brave warriors and daring exploits, imagining a life where courage and honor could shape destiny. These memories, vivid and tangible, became part of the foundation upon which my identity would later be built. Yet, even amidst joy, there was an undercurrent of awareness that life was fragile. I would see older children returning from the factories or fields, faces lined with fatigue and responsibility, and I sensed the weight of reality pressing in. The news from distant lands spoke of conflicts and political tension, whispers of unrest that seemed both remote and imminently threatening. Though I did not fully grasp the magnitude, a quiet understanding took root. The world was larger, more dangerous, and more unpredictable than our little town could contain. At home, lessons of honor and duty were woven into daily routines. My father's work ethic, my mother's endurance, and my brother's protective vigilance created an environment where strength, patience, and moral responsibility were intertwined. These lessons were subtle but profound. I learned to observe, to anticipate, to act with integrity, even in small matters. I watched how neighbors interacted, how the community handled disputes, how respect was earned and lost. Every observation added to the blueprint of my understanding of loyalty, courage, and human behavior, lessons that would become crucial in the coming years. Our family evenings were filled with storytelling. My parents shared tales of their own youth, of historical events, of moral choices made under pressure. These stories were vivid and detailed, often blurring the line between fact and legend. I absorbed them all, committing to memory the examples of bravery, cleverness, and resilience. I learned that courage was not always loud or dramatic. It could be quiet, steadfast, and persistent. Friendship also played a central role in shaping my youth. I had a small circle of friends, each with their own quirks and strengths. We challenged each other, supported each other, and sometimes quarreled, learning early lessons in negotiation, compromise, and loyalty. Through these relationships, I discovered the value of trust and the pain of betrayal, understanding that bonds formed in youth could endure or fracture under pressure. Each season brought new lessons. Winters taught endurance and resourcefulness as we navigated snow-covered streets and frozen rivers, finding ways to play, learn, and survive despite harsh conditions. Spring brought renewal, the awakening of the forests and fields, and a sense of possibility. Summer offered freedom and adventure, while autumn taught preparation and reflection, observing the cycles of nature and the passage of time. These rhythms became part of my understanding of life, time, and the inevitability of change. By the time I approached adolescence, I was already aware of the fragility of youth. I felt that the world beyond our town awaited, full of challenges that would demand courage, sacrifice, and wisdom. I trained my body, reading books, practicing skills, observing the adults around me, and contemplating what it meant to be responsible for more than oneself. I did not yet know that the ultimate test would come in the form of war, that it would take my youth, reshape my identity, and confront me with horrors I could not yet imagine. And yet, despite the looming uncertainty, there was joy, curiosity, and an unbreakable thread of hope. The smell of fresh grass after rain, the laughter of friends, quiet evenings by the stove, the thrill of discovery in the woods, and the stories of courage and honor, all intertwined to create a foundation, a reservoir of memory, strength, and longing that I would draw upon when my life was pulled into the whirlwind of war. My youth was a tapestry of small moments, each adding color and texture, preparing me unknowingly for the trials ahead. It was in these years, amidst the laughter, the hardships, the lessons, and the dreams, that the first seeds of duty, courage, and resilience were planted. They would grow slowly, painfully, and inexorably, preparing me to leave childhood behind, to step into a world where every day could be a fight for survival, and where the ideals of youth would be tested against the harshest realities imaginable. The day I received my draft notice was one I will never forget, though I wished I could erase it from memory. The sun was high in the sky, shining brilliantly as if mocking the storm that had settled in my chest. The streets were slick from a morning rain, reflecting the sunlight in dazzling patterns that made the cobblestones look like molten gold. I held the envelope tightly, feeling the weight of duty pressed down on me like an invisible hand. Inside, the words were clear and unavoidable. I was to serve my country. I was to leave behind the familiar, the beloved, the warmth of my home, and step into a world where death waited patiently at every corner. Saying goodbye to my family was the first real test of strength in my life. My mother, who had always been the pillar of calm and care, broke down, letting tears slip despite her efforts to maintain composure. She clutched me tightly, pressing her cheek to mine, whispering words of encouragement and love I could barely hear through the quivering of her voice. I wanted to promise her that I would return, that I would be careful, that I would survive. But I knew even then that these were hollow words against the reality of what awaited me. My father, stoic and composed in all other aspects of life, struggled to maintain his own demeanor. His hands, usually steady and skilled from years of labor, trembled as he adjusted my pack, and his eyes, so full of pride, betrayed a raw, unspoken fear. My older brother stood silently rigid and tense, his face a mask of restraint, as if he were attempting to transfer through sheer willpower all the wisdom, guidance, and strength he could muster into me before I left. The journey to the mobilization center felt surreal. The train ride was long and quiet, filled with men like me, young, unsure, and heavy with apprehension. Conversations were few. Some stared out the window at passing fields, some whispered prayers, and others tried to laugh, though the laughter always seemed brittle, like it could shatter at any moment. Every mile took me further from my home, from safety, from the life I had known. The clatter of the wheels on the tracks became a rhythm in my mind, a drumbeat of inevitability, reminding me that the life of a civilian was slipping away with each passing second. Arriving at the mobilization camp was like stepping into an entirely new universe. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, dust, and unwashed bodies. The sounds were overwhelming, shouts of officers, the clanging of metal, the endless marching feet, the barked orders echoing across the training fields. We were herded into rows, counted, inspected, and assigned numbers instead of names, a process meant to strip individuality and build a sense of uniformity, obedience, and discipline. The feeling was disorienting. The world I had known, the one filled with laughter, trees, and the warmth of home, was replaced by an unyielding structure where every movement had to be precise, every step deliberate, every action observed. The training was relentless. From dawn until dusk, we were pushed beyond the limits of what I had believed possible. Long marches with heavy packs, runs through muddy fields, climbing obstacles, learning to wield rifles, practicing combat formations. Every day was an exhausting test of endurance and focus. The sun scorched our backs, the rain soaked us to the bone, and the cold winds cut through our thin uniforms like knives. Yet the officers showed no mercy, insisting on perfection, on discipline, on total control of both body and mind. But the real lessons went beyond the physical. We were taught to anticipate danger, to observe our surroundings, to move as a unit. We were drilled in silence and attention, learning that survival depended not just on skill but on awareness and instinct. We learned to watch each other for signs of weakness or hesitation, to understand that the fate of one could affect all. The smallest mistake could lead to injury, even death, and that knowledge pressed on my consciousness constantly, a shadow over every thought. The veterans who occasionally came to speak with us left the deepest impressions. They spoke not of glory or medals, but of endurance, loyalty, and the harsh reality of human frailty under fire. Their eyes held the weight of experience, knowing horrors we had yet to face. They taught us that survival was as much mental as physical, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. Each story they told was layered with lessons: how to hold your composure when chaos erupts, how to act decisively when every second matters, how to maintain humanity when surrounded by inhumanity. Even the daily routines carried lessons. The barracks, though crude, were microcosms of life in miniature. I learned to live with minimal privacy, to share everything from blankets to rations, to negotiate and navigate the subtle hierarchies among recruits. And friendships were forged in sweat and hardship, bonds that often became stronger than family. Yet these relationships were tested constantly. Tempers flared, nerves broke, and sometimes petty disputes escalated into conflicts that required intervention or consequence. Every day was a lesson in patience, understanding, and the complex dynamics of human interaction under stress. Meals were sparse and functional. Bread, watery soup, and occasionally meat were our sustenance. Nothing like the rich, comforting food of home. We learned to stretch rations, to share, to appreciate even the smallest morsel. Hunger became a constant companion, shaping both body and mind, teaching resilience and the value of moderation. Nights were cold and long, the thin blankets barely offering warmth. Sleep was a luxury often interrupted by guard duty, the cries of sentries, or the groans of exhausted comrades. Yet, even in these moments, the camaraderie, the small acts of kindness, the whispered encouragement, the shared stories sustained us. And throughout it all, my mind remained tethered to home. I thought of the streets, The fields, the familiar faces, the smell of the bakery, the warmth of my mother's arms, my father's steady hands, my brother's protective presence. These memories became my anchor, a source of strength amidst the relentless grind. I clung to them desperately, knowing that once the first battle began, life would never be the same. In those early days of mobilization, my youth began to slip away. Each drill, each march, each command etched into me the reality that life would no longer be carefree. I began to understand the sacrifices expected, the pain to be endured, the strength required, not just of the body, but of the spirit. The draft notice was not just a summons to arms, it was a passage into a world that demanded everything, leaving nothing untouched by the shadow of duty and war. By the end of my first month in the camp, I had learned more about myself than in all my years of childhood. I discovered reserves of endurance I did not know existed, a capacity for focus and discipline that astonished me, and a nascent understanding of fear, how it could paralyze, but also how it could sharpen, motivate, and guide. I saw my peers transform in similar ways, boys becoming soldiers, laughter replaced by silence, and innocence slowly giving way to awareness. Every day brought a new lesson, a new challenge, a new step away from the life I had known and closer to the harsh reality of war. The preparation, though grueling, instilled a sense of purpose. Each sunrise brought marching drills, weapons training, and lessons in tactics, but also a growing awareness of responsibility. The choices I would face, the decisions in moments of crisis, would require a mind trained to think under pressure, a body conditioned to endure hardship, and a heart tempered by experience and moral courage. I realized that these months of training were the foundation of survival, the shaping of character, and the prelude to a world that would demand everything I had to give. By the time I was deemed ready to leave the training camp, I was no longer just a boy from a quiet town. I was a soldier in the making, aware of the peril ahead, the sacrifices to be made, and the burden of expectation. The horizon had expanded, revealing the vast, uncertain landscape of war, and I stepped toward it, carrying the memories of home, the lessons of family, and the fragile but growing confidence that I might endure, that I might survive, that I might return, changed but still whole in spirit. The morning of the first battle arrived with a deceptive calm. The sun was pale behind a thin veil of clouds, casting a gray light over the fields that stretched endlessly ahead. Dew clung to the grass, sparkling like tiny diamonds, but there was no joy in its beauty. Every soldier in our company moved with silent urgency, the weight of packs and rifles heavy on our shoulders, our hearts heavier still with unspoken fear. I could feel the tension in the air, a tangible pressure that pressed down on everyone, threading its way into every muscle and nerve. As we approached the front lines, the world changed. The landscape, once familiar and peaceful, was now a tableau of impending violence. Trampled fields, barbed wire fences, and distant smokes curling into the sky like sinister signals. Every shadow seemed alive, every rustle a possible threat. I noticed how the younger recruits fidgeted, eyes wide, some pale, some trembling, while veterans moved with grim focus, masks of experience hiding emotions they had long since buried. The first shots were deafening. They tore through the air, shaking the ground beneath us. The sound of rifles and artillery was overwhelming, each explosion a reminder that death was no longer a distant concept, but a living presence. My ears rang, my chest tightened. I froze for a moment, paralyzed by shock, by the sheer sensory assault. Around me, men shouted, dove for cover, some screaming, some silent, their expressions contorted with fear and determination. I remember the smell first, the acrid bite of gunpowder mixed with the metallic tang of blood, the earthy scent of upturned soil, and something else I could not name, the pervasive stench of fear. The field was chaotic, a mix of moving bodies, smoke, and the harsh bark of commands from officers who themselves were under the same pressure yet forced to lead. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to hide, to survive. Yet another part, the part trained in the weeks of mobilization, urged me forward, to act, to respond, to live through this. Time seemed to fracture, moments stretched into eternity, each decision split-second yet monumental. I saw my first comrade fall. He had been a cheerful boy from the same town as me, laughing only days before. Now he lay motionless, a dark stain spreading across his uniform. I felt a wave of helpless rage, terror, and sorrow wash over me, a mixture of grief and adrenaline that propelled me forward. Survival demanded action, not grief. I ducked behind a mound of earth, reloaded my rifle with trembling hands, and scanned the battlefield for the next threat. The first encounter was brutal. Bullets whistled past, striking the ground and ricocheting off obstacles. Smoke thickened, obscuring vision, making it almost impossible to distinguish friend from foe. I learned quickly that instinct alone would not suffice. Every movement, every decision could mean the difference between life and death. I observed others around me, some frozen, some acting with deadly precision, some screaming in panic. It was a living classroom in fear, courage, and the raw mechanics of human survival. Amid the chaos, my mind raced. I questioned everything. Why had I come here? What was the meaning of this carnage? Was courage the ability to act despite fear, or the denial of the human instinct to flee? Each thought collided with another, creating a storm of emotion that threatened to overwhelm me. Yet through the fog of confusion, a clarity emerged. I had to survive, not for glory, not for recognition, but for the possibility of returning home, to see family, to reclaim some fragment of the life I had left behind. I remember the sound of screams most vividly. They were everywhere, some of them young, untrained voices filled with panic, others the deliberate shouts of officers trying to direct movements, some guttural, raw, filled with pain. Each cry left an imprint on my consciousness, etching the reality of war into my soul. I realized that this chaos was not momentary. It was the essence of combat, relentless, indifferent, unforgiving. We moved as a unit when possible, coordinating under impossible conditions. Smoke, mud, and debris made communication difficult. Hand signals became essential. I saw men carrying the wounded, risking their lives to pull comrades out of line of fire. Some refused to move until their friend was safe. It was in these acts, small yet monumental, that the raw humanity of soldiers revealed itself. Courage was not in the grand gestures, but in the quiet, terrifying decisions made under pressure, in the choice to act when everything screamed for retreat. The first night after the battle was worse than the fighting. Exhaustion clawed at every fiber of my being. My hands shook, my legs ached, and sleep was impossible. Around me, comrades whispered softly, trying to maintain sanity, recounting memories of home, laughing quietly at old jokes to stave off the creeping dread. I lay awake, staring at the stars obscured by smoke and ash, thinking of the fields of my childhood, the warmth of my mother's embrace, the laughter of my friends. These memories were fragile shields against the encroaching madness of the battlefield. In those hours of darkness, I reflected on my own mortality for the first time in full awareness. The faces of the fallen, the screams, the destruction, they were no longer abstract concepts. They were tangible, inescapable, etched into my consciousness. I realized that the war would strip away my youth in ways unimaginable. The boy who had played in fields, who had dreamed of heroism in stories, was gone. In his place stood a soldier, forged in fear, survival, and necessity, carrying both the burden of memory and the imperative to endure. The first battle taught lessons that no training could fully convey. Fear could sharpen focus, could save lives, and even in chaos, small acts of bravery mattered immensely. I learned that every moment was precious, that survival depended on awareness, instinct, and sometimes sheer luck. Most of all, I learned the cruel truth of war. It is indiscriminate, consuming the innocent and guilty alike, leaving only those who adapt and endure. By the end of that first encounter, my world had irrevocably changed. The horizon that had once seemed distant and abstract was now a realm of constant danger and moral reckoning. I carried with me the images, sounds, and smells of that day, each a permanent reminder of what it meant to step into a world where life and death were governed not by fairness, but by circumstance, courage, and endurance. Even after weeks of fighting, I continued to replay each moment, analyzing decisions, remembering every fallen friend, every narrow escape. I realized that fear would always be a companion, that courage was not an absence of fear, but the mastery of it, and that the boy who had left home full of dreams was forever altered, carrying the heavy weight of experience and the first taste of mortality. Life between battles was a different kind of war, one just as grueling and unrelenting as the firefights themselves, though it wore a quieter, subtler face. The world seemed to shrink to the size of the camp, the muddy trenches, the worn tents, and the endless stretch of barbed wire and shell-pocked fields. Time lost its meaning. Days blurred into nights, punctuated only by the occasional distant roar of artillery or the sudden jarring whistle of incoming shells. Each morning, I awoke to a reality I had never known in my youth, a life where survival was measured not in comforts or accomplishments, but in food, rest, and the endurance of the body and mind. The barracks were cramped and oppressive, rows of cots pressed together with no space for privacy, no room for dignity. My pack, muddy and heavy, remained at my side, and every item in it was essential. A few changes of clothing, basic hygiene items, the small token of home, a letter, a photo, a memento that anchored me to a life I might never see again. The smell of damp fabric, sweat, and unwashed bodies permeated everything, clinging to the air and my skin. Sleep was a fleeting visitor. Even when my body sank into the thin mattress, dreams were haunted by flashes of battle, the faces of fallen comrades, and the unrelenting fear of what was to come. Meals were minimal and monotonous. Bread that had long since lost freshness, watery soup with floating scraps of vegetables, and occasionally a piece of meat or a tin of canned fish formed our diet. Hunger became a constant companion, gnawing at the stomach, sharpening the mind, and forcing the body to adapt. Eating was no longer a pleasure, it was a necessity, a ritual to maintain energy, to keep the muscles from failing under the relentless strain of marches, drills, and laborious duties. Those who complained, those who refused, quickly found themselves reminded that survival depended on cooperation and endurance. Between battles, the soldiers developed routines that were part necessity, part superstition. Washing in the cold, muddied streams, tending to minor wounds, cleaning rifles, mending torn uniforms. These small acts became rituals that anchored us, giving a semblance of order in a world gone mad. Yet, no matter how meticulous we were, dirt, blood, and exhaustion always prevailed. Life was a constant negotiation with discomfort, hunger, and fear, and only those who adapted could maintain the strength to endure. I began to understand the psychological toll of this existence. Fear was a constant companion, whispering in every shadow, in every creak of a floorboard, in every sudden gust of wind. Sleep-deprived and exhausted, our minds became prey to hallucinations and anxiety. Some soldiers muttered to themselves, pacing endlessly. Others wept quietly, hiding it from officers and comrades alike. I found myself lying awake for hours, imagining scenarios of ambush, imagining the faces of family members back home, wondering if I would ever see them again. Conversations between soldiers were a lifeline. We spoke of home, of lost friends, of hopes and dreams that seemed impossibly distant. Humor, though rare, became a weapon against despair. We laughed quietly at small absurdities, the futility of orders, the strange habits of commanding officers, the bizarre contradictions of military life. Yet, beneath the laughter lurked tension, each joke a thin veil over the anxiety that permeated every waking moment. Letters from home were sacred treasures. Each one carried warmth, love, and a connection to a life that felt increasingly like a dream. I would read and reread them, memorizing every word, clinging to phrases, imagining voices and expressions, and allowing myself brief moments of escape from the unending demands of military life. Yet the letters also carried pain, the knowledge that life continued without us, that the passage of time might leave us forever behind, that every day in the trenches was a day further from childhood, family, and innocence. We performed drills and minor operations between battles, exercises meant to maintain readiness but often draining us further, long marches across muddy fields, reconnaissance patrols along dangerous perimeters, and continuous inspections by officers kept our bodies tense and alert. Every rustle in the brush, every distant sound, triggered instinctual reactions. Even during so-called quiet moments, we remained vigilant, knowing that a single lapse could be fatal. The bonds between soldiers deepened in these days. Shared suffering created unspoken trust and solidarity. We watched each other, instinctively aware of who could be relied upon, who might crack under pressure. Acts of selflessness emerged. A shared ration, a helping hand while carrying equipment, a whispered reassurance in the dark. These moments, small yet profound, were the foundation of survival, the glue that held fragile lives together amid the ever-present threat of death. I also began to understand the insidious nature of fear. It was not always loud or immediate. Sometimes it was subtle, a tightening in the chest, a hesitation before a step, a shadow in the corner of the eye. It could paralyze, yes, but it could also sharpen, heighten senses, and force decisions that might otherwise be delayed. I learned to respect fear, to use it, and to acknowledge it without surrendering to it. Each day between battles was a psychological battlefield as demanding as any firefight, requiring courage, endurance, and mental resilience. The monotony of waiting, of surviving, rather than fighting, was itself a kind of torture. Days dragged into nights, punctuated only by brief flashes of activity or sudden terror. Letters were read and reread, memories of home recounted endlessly, prayers muttered quietly in tents or in muddy ditches. I observed the transformation of those around me, boys becoming men through hardship, laughter turning to silence, optimism eroding under relentless strain. And I felt myself changing, every day a small step away from the boy I had been, every thought and action reshaping me into a soldier hardened by experience, yet not yet broken. Even the smallest acts became imbued with meaning. Tending to a wounded comrade, sharing a piece of bread, lighting a fire in the rain, each act was a defiance of the chaos around us, a statement that humanity could endure even when the world seemed determined to erase it. These moments carried weight, carrying not only survival, but also the fragile hope that one day the war would end, that life might be reclaimed, and that the boy who had once played in sunlit fields might still find a way back. By the end of the first months between battles, I had begun to measure life not in years, months, or days, but in moments of endurance, decisions under pressure, and acts of courage, no matter how small. I had seen fear, despair, exhaustion, and hopelessness, and had learned to navigate them, to survive, to remain conscious of the fragile line between life and death. Each day was a lesson, each night a crucible, and every small victory a step toward enduring the unimaginable trials that lay ahead. Life as a soldier between battles was a slow, grinding process of transformation. My body became stronger, more resilient, my mind sharper, more attuned to danger, my heart more cautious, yet still capable of hope. I was becoming something I had not been before, a person forged in uncertainty, fear, and endurance, carrying the weight of memory, duty, and a fragile dream of returning home. The morning was thick with fog, a suffocating gray that clung to the fields and trenches like a living entity. The sun was hidden behind a veil of clouds, casting a dim, pallid light over the land, making shadows deeper, shapes less distinct, and every movement uncertain. I stood among my unit, the damp cold seeping through my uniform, the mud sticking to my boots, and the weight of my pack pressing down on my shoulders like a reminder of the burdens ahead. Silence had descended over us, the quiet before the storm, and it was heavier than any roar of artillery I had yet experienced. I could feel the tension in the air. Men shifted uneasily, adjusting packs, rifles, and helmets, stealing glances at each other for reassurance that no one dared voice aloud. The fog seemed to distort sounds. Distant artillery cracks felt nearer. Footsteps sounded like enemy advance, and the whisper of the wind through broken trees became a warning. Every sense was heightened, every instinct alive, and yet beneath it all, a creeping, unshakable dread settled in my chest. The first battle had taught me the meaning of fear, but now I understood that experience did not diminish terror. It only refined it, made it sharper, more precise, more real. Orders came down, precise and clipped, and we moved forward into the unknown. The terrain was unforgiving. Shell craters filled with water, jagged remains of barbed wire, splintered trees, and destroyed farmhouses. Each step required caution. Each moment held danger. Bullets began to strike the earth around us almost immediately, some whistling past our heads, others thudding into the soil with bone-rattling force. The cacophony of war was overwhelming. Shouts of officers, explosions, screams of the wounded, the rhythmic pounding of boots on wet earth, all blending into a terrifying symphony of chaos. I witnessed death in ways no child could imagine. Comrades who had laughed and shared stories only hours before fell in an instant, faces frozen in shock or agony. The smell of blood, gunpowder, and mud mingled into a stench that clung to clothing, hair, and skin. Every time someone fell, I felt a mix of grief, anger, and survival instinct, each emotion fighting for dominance in my mind. I learned quickly that paralysis meant death. Action meant survival, even as every movement felt uncertain, even as every decision could cost a life. I remember dragging a wounded friend to cover, feeling the weight of his body and the heat of blood on my hands. His groans were muffled, his eyes wide with terror. I whispered reassurances I did not entirely believe, praying silently that someone would help, that he would survive, that I would survive. Around us, the battlefield continued in unrelenting chaos. Smoke curled into the sky in dark, choking plumes. The ground shook with each distant explosion. Shouts of officers cut through the din, attempting to impose order on the uncontainable maelstrom. We moved in coordination, yet coordination was fragile, constantly threatened by fear, exhaustion, and confusion. I saw men disoriented, some frozen, some charging recklessly, some screaming in pain or terror. Each action could trigger a chain reaction, endangering dozens. We learned to read subtle cues, the position of a comrade's head, the angle of a weapon, the tension in a hand. Survival depended on observation, reaction, and trust. But trust was constantly tested, fragile as the mud we trudged through. Hunger and fatigue added another layer to the torment. Weeks of insufficient food, constant exertion, and little sleep had worn our bodies thin. Muscles ached, bones protested, and every breath felt heavy. Yet the mind remained alert, forced to process threats, anticipate moves, and make decisions under pressure. I discovered a new level of endurance, a capacity to push beyond pain, to continue functioning when the body demanded rest, when the mind screamed to retreat. This was the cost of war. The relentless demand for performance, the stripping away of comfort, the substitution of raw necessity for all else. The wounded were everywhere. Men groaning quietly in shallow trenches, others screaming as medics worked feverishly, the scent of blood thick and overwhelming. Some tried to help each other, dragging friends out of line of fire, improvising stretchers from broken boards and canvas. Every act of compassion carried risk, every movement measured against the likelihood of death. I learned that heroism in war was often quiet, uncelebrated, a matter of simple human decency in impossible circumstances. Death was intimate. I saw the expression frozen on a comrade's face, heard the last whispered words of another, felt the shudder of a body collapsing near me. It was no longer abstract. It was immediate, unavoidable, relentless. Each encounter reshaped my understanding of life, its fragility, its value, and the weight of responsibility we carried for one another. I realized that every day we survived, every small victory, was a testament to endurance, courage, and the fragile thread that separated life from oblivion. Amid the fighting, moments of clarity emerged. A glance at a fallen comrade, a shared smile with a friend amid chaos, a quiet thought of family back home. These flashes of humanity were as vital as ammunition, as essential as shelter. They reminded us of what we fought for, why we endured, and that beneath the uniform, beneath the soldier, remained the boy who had once dreamed of heroism on sunlit fields. The aftermath of battle was a different torment. We counted losses, tended to the wounded, scavenged supplies, and buried the dead when possible. The landscape bore scars of violence, craters, broken trees, scorched earth, and the lingering scent of gunpowder and decay. The silence that followed was eerie, punctuated by distant artillery or the moans of the dying. Each of us carried invisible wounds, memories that would not fade, images that would intrude in dreams and waking hours alike. Psychological strain became as dangerous as bullets. Men argued over trivial matters, erupted in fits of rage, or sank into silent despair. Some withdrew entirely, sitting apart, staring into the distance, muttering incomprehensibly. Others clung desperately to routine, to letters, to memories of home, to anything that tethered them to a world beyond death and mud. I found myself vacillating between hope and despair, between fear and resolve, learning to navigate the delicate balance required to remain functional, alert, and human. In the quiet moments, I reflected endlessly on home, on childhood, on everything I had left behind. I remembered the smell of fresh bread, the laughter of friends, the warmth of my family, and I clung to these memories like a lifeline. They became fuel, sustaining me when food was scarce, when sleep was impossible, when fear threatened to paralyze me. Each memory was a spark of life in a world dominated by death. By the end of the second major engagement, my body and mind were irrevocably altered. Muscles burned with exhaustion, skin was raw and bruised, and my senses were sharpened to a painful edge. My understanding of courage had deepened. It was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it, over and over again, day after day, in the face of overwhelming odds. I had witnessed death, horror, and sacrifice on a scale that no child could imagine, and yet I endured. The cost of war became clear in every aspect of life: physical, mental, emotional, and moral. Every decision carried weight. Every action could lead to life or death. I began to understand the meaning of sacrifice, the price of duty, and the heavy, unrelenting burden of responsibility for those around me. And I realized that the boy who had once run through sunlit fields dreaming of heroism was gone, replaced by a soldier tempered by fear, endurance, and the relentless reality of war. Even now, years later, the images remain vivid. The mud, the blood, the screams, the quiet moments of reflection, the fleeting flashes of hope and humanity. They shaped me, forged me, and took from me my youth, leaving in its place a hardened awareness of life, death, and the profound cost of duty. The battlefield is more than a place. It is a crucible, reshaping every soul that walks upon it, leaving behind scars that neither time nor memory can erase. The day I left the front lines for the journey home, the world felt both impossibly vast and unbearably small. The train station was chaotic, filled with the tired, the broken, and the fortunate. Soldiers like me carried the weight of months, years of suffering and endurance, etched into every line of their faces, every tremor in their hands, every twitch of a scarred muscle. I looked around and saw boys who had become men, men who had been stripped of innocence, their eyes reflecting experiences too deep to share. The air smelled of coal, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of lingering blood, a reminder that the battlefield never fully left us. The train ride itself was surreal. Each passing town, each familiar landscape was layered with memory and loss. I watched the countryside blur, forests and fields moving past my window, and I thought of the endless green spaces of my youth, the riverbanks, the forests, the sun-dappled fields where my friends and I had played as children. Those days seemed impossibly distant, almost unreal, like a memory of someone else's life. And yet, they were the anchor that kept me tethered to humanity, to hope, to the possibility of returning to a life untainted by the horrors I had witnessed. Arriving home was an experience of contradictions. The town had not changed, yet it was unfamiliar. The streets were the same. The bakeries still emitted its comforting smell. The old oak tree still stood tall. But I had changed. My eyes, once filled with curiosity and innocence, now bore the weight of what I had seen: death, suffering, fear, and the relentless demands of survival. I walked through familiar streets as though I were a ghost, noticing details that had never mattered before. The way the sun glinted off the windows, the laughter of children echoing down the lanes, the subtle smells of the earth after rain. Each sensation was both comforting and painfully alien, a reminder that life continued while I had been elsewhere, living on the edge of existence. My family's reunion with me was overwhelming. My mother ran to me first, embracing me with a strength that belied her frailty, pressing me to her chest as if she could transfer life back into me, heal the years of absence and fear. My father's eyes glistened with unshed tears, his hand shaking as he adjusted my collar, as if he were afraid to let me go again. My younger sister clung to my leg, laughing through tears, a mixture of joy, relief, and confusion. My brother, ever stoic, finally allowed himself to relax, placing a hand on my shoulder with a quiet, almost imperceptible smile. The weight of absence, of fear, of unspoken worries, dissolved in that embrace, yet it left behind a residue of memory, a deep awareness of all that had changed. Returning to the rhythms of civilian life was not simple. The world of home was simultaneously familiar and alien. I struggled to reconnect with friends who had not shared my experiences, who still lived lives bounded by innocence and routine. Conversations were awkward, laughter felt hollow at times. I realized that the war had not only taken my youth, it had created a gap between me and those who had remained, a distance that words could not bridge. Memories of the battlefield intruded upon mundane life. The smell of mud and blood in the kitchen, the echo of gunfire in the marketplace, the faces of fallen comrades and the smiles of neighbors. Sleep remained elusive. Even in the quiet of my own bed, I was haunted by dreams, flashes of combat, cries of the wounded, the relentless roar of artillery, the faces of friends lost forever. Each night, I relived battles, relived mistakes, relived moments of fear and courage, until the line between dream and reality blurred. I learned to navigate this new terrain with the same caution I had learned on the battlefield: patience, observation, and endurance. The mind became a battlefield as intense as any physical confrontation. Reflecting on the past, I understood the full cost of what I had endured. I had lost not only my youth, but a sense of innocence, a sense of certainty, a sense of untroubled hope. The war had reshaped my understanding of courage, sacrifice, and morality. I had learned that heroism was often quiet, invisible, and uncelebrated, that survival depended on decisions that were morally ambiguous, that strength often lay not in power, but in endurance. I had witnessed the limits of human resilience and the depths of human cruelty, and both had left indelible marks on my soul. Yet, in the midst of grief and trauma, there were moments of profound revelation. I learned to treasure the smallest joys, the warmth of sunlight on my face, the sound of birdsong, the laughter of children, the simple pleasure of a hot meal. I cherished the presence of family, the comfort of shared stories, the stability of routine. These experiences, once mundane, became precious, almost sacred, for they were reminders that life continued, that hope persisted, and that humanity could endure even after unimaginable horror. I sought out the graves of fallen friends, reading names etched in stone, tracing the curves of letters with trembling fingers. I remembered their voices, their laughter, their dreams. I wept for them silently, privately, knowing that the world had moved on without them. I realized that part of returning home was carrying their memory forward, honoring their sacrifice by living, by striving to retain the humanity that war had tried to strip away. Reintegrating into society required negotiation with my own mind. Simple interactions, a handshake, a conversation, a smile, felt loaded with meaning. I noticed the fragility of emotions, the weight of unspoken thoughts, the difficulty of reconciling memory with reality. I observed the complacency of those untouched by war, the contrast between their trivial concerns and the gravity of what I had witnessed. I learned to communicate carefully, to measure words, to find solace in shared understanding where it existed, and to endure loneliness where it did not. Over time, I discovered the power of reflection. I wrote, I spoke, I walked alone through familiar forests and fields, revisiting the landscapes of my youth with new eyes. Each step was a meditation, each memory a lesson, each reflection a reconciliation of the boy I had been with the soldier I had become. I began to understand that my life was irrevocably changed, yet it was still mine to shape, still mine to honor the sacrifices of those who had not returned. The war had taught me the fragility and resilience of life, the importance of courage and endurance, and the profound cost of duty. It had taken my youth, yes, but it had also imparted wisdom, awareness, and a deep appreciation for the simple human aspects of existence. Every embrace, every shared meal, every quiet moment became infused with meaning. I had learned to recognize the extraordinary in the ordinary, to see life as precious not for its permanence, but for its impermanence. I walked through the streets of my hometown with a new perspective. I noticed the laughter of children playing, the chatter of neighbors, the rhythms of everyday life. I understood that the world I had left behind had continued, and that I could still find a place within it, carrying both memory and experience as gifts and burdens alike. The war had ended a chapter of my life, but it had also opened another, a chapter of reflection, growth, and the painstaking reconstruction of self. I understood that the true cost of war is measured not only in lives lost or battles fought, but in the irrevocable change it imposes on every survivor. The boy who had once run through fields, dreaming of heroism and glory, had been transformed into a man tempered by fear, endurance, and understanding, and in this transformation lay both sorrow and strength, grief and resilience, memory and hope. Life returned, slowly, painfully, beautifully. I relearned joy, redefined courage, and embraced the fragile, fleeting nature of existence. I found that even after the deepest darkness, there could be light. Even after the heaviest loss, there could be connection. Even after the most profound horror, there could be hope. And I carried that knowledge forward, a testament to survival, reflection, and the enduring power of the human spirit. The war had ended decades ago, yet its shadow stretched long, impossibly long, across every facet of my existence. I carried it with me like a second skin, invisible to the eyes of the world, but heavier than any pack I had ever borne on the battlefield. Each morning, as the sun filtered through the curtains and the quiet world outside seemed untouched by the horrors I had endured, I awoke to memories, sounds, smells, and images that refused to fade. The echo of gunfire, the scent of mud and blood, the faces of comrades who had fallen. They were not ghosts, but living parts of me, woven indelibly into my being. Returning to civilian life had been only the first step in a long, arduous journey. At first, I attempted to resume a semblance of normalcy, to rebuild the routines of a life that had been violently interrupted. Yet every act, drinking coffee, walking through the marketplace, reading a newspaper, carried the weight of a dual existence. I was simultaneously here and still there, in the trenches, in the smoke, in the chaos. Each moment of peace was tinged with remembrance, each smile or laugh shadowed by the memory of those who could no longer share it. I began to reflect on the true cost of war, not just in lives lost, but in the erosion of innocence, the reshaping of identity, the alteration of perception itself. My youth, vibrant and unburdened, had been traded for endurance, vigilance, and a deep, sometimes unbearable, awareness of mortality. I had been forced to understand death intimately, to negotiate with fear constantly, to make decisions under pressure that tested not only skill, but morality. These lessons, though invaluable, left scars invisible to the outside world. The boy who had once played in sunlit fields, who had dreamed of heroism and idyllic simplicity, no longer existed. In his place stood a man forged by trauma, resilience, and unrelenting memory. Time passed, and I aged, though the process was uneven, influenced as much by memory and reflection as by the simple passage of years. I watched my contemporaries grow older, some untouched by war, some marked by different struggles, while I remained tethered to a past that refused to loosen its grip. The towns I had known became landscapes layered with nostalgia, the streets and buildings familiar yet alien, filtered through the lens of experience that no one else shared. Each reunion, each visit home, was a negotiation between who I had been and who I had become. I thought often of the friends and comrades I had lost. Their faces, names, laughter, and final moments were etched into my mind, becoming symbols of sacrifice and the fragility of life. I would walk through cemeteries, tracing names with trembling fingers, recalling the stories behind each grave. In these acts of remembrance I found solace, purpose, and connection, even as grief never fully released its grip. The living carried on, but the war had claimed a permanent presence in my heart, a constant awareness that life could be fleeting, fragile, and unpredictable. Psychological wounds were as real and persistent as physical ones. Nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, these were daily companions, invisible yet insistent. I developed rituals to manage them, walking long distances in solitude, writing my thoughts, speaking to others who understood, immersing myself in the rhythms of ordinary life to anchor myself. Even then, triggers were everywhere. The crack of a branch on a quiet street, the sudden shout of a child, the smell of smoke from a fire, each could transport me back to the front lines in a heartbeat. I learned that survival extended beyond the battlefield. It required mastering the mind, reconciling memory and reality, and finding peace in a life irrevocably changed. Family became my anchor, the tether to continuity and hope. My parents eventually passed, but their lessons, love, and memory remained. I watched siblings grow old, children of friends become adults, and generations unfold, all while the memories of war quietly influenced my every choice. The small acts of daily life, feeding a neighbor's dog, tending a garden, walking through a sunlit field, took on profound significance. Each gesture was a reminder that life persisted, that beauty existed even amid suffering, and that the human spirit, though scarred, could endure. I sought out others who had survived, men and women who shared the same invisible burdens. In these connections, I found understanding, empathy, and shared wisdom. We spoke of courage, fear, loss, and endurance. We recalled moments of heroism, acts of kindness, and small victories that had saved lives. These conversations were a lifeline, a validation that the experiences we had endured were not meaningless, that survival was not simply a matter of chance, but also a testament to resilience, adaptability, and human connection. I began to ponder the larger meaning of existence after such profound trauma. War had taught me that life was fragile, that human actions carried immense weight, that morality was often complicated by necessity, and that courage could manifest in subtle, almost invisible ways. I realized that to live fully, one must embrace memory without being consumed by it, cherish joy without denying grief, and recognize the transient nature of both suffering and happiness. The lessons of the battlefield became philosophical principles for life: awareness, endurance, empathy, and the pursuit of a purpose. Old age brought its own reflections. As my body weakened, muscles aching and vision dimming, I found that the mind became a repository for memory and insight. I would sit for hours in quiet contemplation, recalling battles, comrades, and moments of both terror and courage. I wrote extensively, chronicling experiences not only for myself, but to preserve memory for those who might never understand the true cost of duty. I understood that the story of my youth, lost to war, was now part of a larger tapestry, a contribution to history, humanity, and the ongoing dialogue about courage, sacrifice, and endurance. Community became a focus of healing and purpose. I participated in remembrance ceremonies, mentored younger generations, and worked to convey the importance of empathy, courage, and moral responsibility. I discovered that survival was insufficient without meaning, that life after war required not only endurance, but also engagement, teaching, and the cultivation of values that could endure beyond personal memory. Every act of kindness, every story shared, every lesson passed down was a tribute to those lost and a reaffirmation of life itself. I often walked in the fields of my childhood, reflecting on the cycles of life, the persistence of nature, and the fleeting yet profound impact of human experience. I thought of the boy I had been, the soldier I became, and the man I now was. The war had taken my youth, yet it had also given insight, perspective, and an acute awareness of mortality, resilience, and the essence of being human. I learned to cherish the present, honor the past, and prepare for the inevitable future, however uncertain it might be. The long shadow of war stretched across every moment, every decision, and every emotion. Yet within that shadow, I discovered light, the capacity for reflection, the ability to love and connect, the resilience to endure, and the wisdom to understand that life, though fragile, is precious beyond measure. I carried the memory of fallen comrades, the lessons of suffering, and the enduring truth that courage is not simply the absence of fear, but the determination to live fully, ethically, and with purpose, even in the aftermath of unimaginable hardship. In the end, I understood that survival was not merely about living. It was about integrating memory, loss, and experience into a coherent, purposeful existence. I had lost my youth on the battlefield, yes, but I had gained a profound understanding of life, mortality, and humanity. Each day became an exercise in appreciation, reflection, and action. The war remained a part of me, yet it did not define me entirely. I was, at last, able to reconcile the boy I had been, the soldier I became, and the man I was still becoming. Life continued, fragile and unpredictable, but infused with meaning, purpose, and an enduring connection to those who had shaped it through love, sacrifice, and shared experience. And in that understanding, I found peace. Though the shadows of war would always remain, they no longer consumed me. I had learned to walk with them, to honor them, and to live fully in the light of memory, reflection, and the unyielding human spirit. The war began in ways that none of us could truly anticipate. I remember the first day I arrived at the training camp, the smell of fresh-cut grass mixed with gun oil and unwashed bodies, the nervous laughter of new recruits, the stern faces of instructors. Every morning was filled with drills, exercises, and the endless repetition of movements, words, and commands designed to instill discipline, endurance, and fearlessness. The uniform felt heavy, almost suffocating, yet it was the first sign that I was leaving childhood behind. Each day was a lesson, each lesson a step toward transformation, though none of us could foresee the extent of the changes awaiting us. Weeks turned into months. My body hardened, my mind sharpened, yet the hardest lessons were those the instructors could not teach. The subtleties of fear, the necessity of trust, and the delicate balance between courage and survival. We learned to anticipate danger, to move quietly, to read every shadow, every sound, every whisper of the wind. I remember one night lying awake in the freezing dark, listening to the groans of men and the distant barking of orders, and feeling a strange combination of isolation and unity, a sense that we were all bound together by shared vulnerability, yet destined to confront death individually. The first battles were brutal. We moved into shell-pocked fields, navigating mud, barbed wire, and the occasional unexploded ordnance. Bullets whistled past, artillery shook the earth, and screams pierced the air. I saw friends fall, some without warning, their expressions frozen in terror or disbelief. I carried a wounded comrade to safety, my hands slick with blood, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. That day, I learned that courage is not grandiose. It is instinctive, immediate, and often terrifying. Days between battles were no less demanding. Camp life was harsh. Inadequate food, incessant cold, diseases that spread with terrifying ease, and the constant threat of enemy action. Yet we found small joys, shared jokes, stolen moments of laughter, letters from home, or simply a hot meal. We developed routines that balanced survival and sanity, cleaning rifles, tending to minor injuries, digging trenches, and memorizing the topography. Every action was both necessity and ritual, a testament to our adaptation in a world that demanded constant vigilance. Night brought its own horrors. Sleep was fragmented by nightmares, flashes of explosions, the faces of fallen friends, screams that had once been real, now invading dreams. I learned to recognize the subtle onset of trauma, the creeping anxiety, the occasional dissociation from reality that allowed us to endure just a few more hours. I also learned to rely on the quiet support of comrades, to share burdens silently, to recognize when a man was faltering and needed aid, sometimes more urgently than even on the battlefield itself. In the heat of combat, I saw the spectrum of human behavior, bravery and cowardice, selflessness and selfishness, loyalty and betrayal. One moment, a soldier might risk his life to save another. The next, panic could drive him to flee. I observed officers making impossible decisions, weighing the lives of men against objectives that sometimes seemed meaningless. And I understood slowly that war was not only about strategy and weapons, it was about understanding the human mind, the unpredictability of emotion, and the necessity of endurance under impossible circumstances. I returned home years later, changed beyond recognition. My parents, siblings, and friends were there, yet the gulf between us was immense. I had aged in ways invisible to others. My youth, taken by years of fear, loss, and responsibility, could never be regained. I tried to reintegrate, to feel joy in ordinary activities, yet the memories of war intruded constantly. The cries of the wounded, the mud, the blood, the unbearable weight of responsibility. I found that life after war was another battlefield, one fought within the mind, within memory, and within the very fabric of identity. Family life became a paradox, comforting yet alien. Conversations were difficult, laughter sometimes hollow. I was haunted by absence, of friends, of comrades, of the innocence I had left behind. And yet, slowly, through routine, reflection, and the small acts of daily life, I rebuilt connections, reestablished purpose, and learned to navigate the complexities of memory and reality. Letters, photos, stories shared with others who had endured became anchors. Each act of remembrance was both a tribute and a means of survival, a way to carry forward those who could no longer walk beside me. Old age brought reflection. I considered the nature of courage, the cost of sacrifice, and the fragility of life. I realized that the war had imparted lessons beyond mere survival, the importance of empathy, endurance, moral reasoning, and the subtle ways that human connection shapes existence. I chronicled experiences not as bragging or lament, but as an offering to those who might never know the realities behind the history books. I wrote of fear, hope, loss, joy, despair, and resilience, attempting to preserve the essence of what it meant to endure, to fight, and to survive. The war remained with me, yet I learned to live alongside it. I celebrated the simple, fleeting joys, the warmth of the sun, the laughter of children, the quiet companionship of friends. I reconciled memory with present experience, recognizing that though the battlefield had taken my youth, it had also given perspective, wisdom, and a profound appreciation for the fragility and beauty of life. I understood that the true measure of survival was not mere existence, but the ability to integrate memory, loss, and growth into a coherent, meaningful life. The faces of fallen comrades remained vivid, etched into my consciousness. I honored them through action, by living, by remembering, by teaching, by reflecting, and by cherishing moments of connection and purpose. Each day became a meditation, each interaction a measure of humanity, each reflection an acknowledgement of the debt owed to those who did not return. And in this ongoing process, I found reconciliation, acceptance, and the capacity to embrace life fully, even with the shadow of loss ever present. The long arc of my life, boyhood, battle, survival, reflection, taught me that the essence of humanity is endurance, memory, and love. War had stripped me bare, but in that stripping, it revealed resilience. In the face of unimaginable terror, I discovered courage. In the presence of death, I discovered empathy. In enduring loss, I discovered the importance of remembrance. And finally, in embracing life after war, I discovered that survival is not merely a biological fact, but a profound moral and emotional triumph. Life, even after such devastation, remained precious, fragile, and infinitely complex. I walked through fields that had once been playgrounds, through towns that had persisted despite destruction, through forests that had witnessed both innocence and bloodshed. Each step was an act of acknowledgement, of memory, of loss, of enduring human spirit. And I knew that though the boy I had been was gone, the man I had become carried forward everything that was necessary to honor life, war, and the enduring legacy of those who had sacrificed everything. I lived reflecting, remembering, enduring, and in that living I discovered the ultimate lesson, that even amidst the deepest shadows, human resilience, memory, and love remain, shaping not only survival, but the meaning of existence itself. The war had taken my youth, yes, but it had also given me a life infused with awareness, depth, and the capacity to understand the full spectrum of human experience.